Tell me what Putin thinks of Navalny.
I think it's really important to give some context first. And if you and me play a game of tennis, I'm going to try to beat you, but I'll try to beat you within the rules of the game. It will be uninteresting for me to lower the net when you're not looking. It'll be uninteresting for me to fiddle with your racket. That will take away the point of the game. And so when we're competing with each other, we're at the same time engaged in a shared exercise of trust and cooperation. So we are opponents without being enemies. And that distinction is elemental to democratic process. Putin doesn't believe in it. Let me just repeat that. Putin does not believe in that distinction, which is to say that the attitude in the West on this issue is mostly wrong. Because the predominant thing you hear from Western journalists is that Putin knows this distinction very well, and he knows that that's the right way to run a society, but because he is a crook, and because he is a thief, and because he is corrupt, and because he is a dictator, whatever else, he doesn't want to go there. But the reality is, he doesn't get it. And so therefore, from his vantage point, when Western democracies talk about competition, but within the bracket of certain rules for shared cooperation, and that way distinguish opponents from enemies, he thinks that's fake. In other words, he thinks that there's a narrative of having political opponents who aren't enemies in the West. But it's really just a narrative. It's not really true. They're faking it, and that's actually one of the reasons why he is so reassured, as it were, about the democratic decline in the West. He's seeing it as a vindication of the fact that the stories Western democracies tell about themselves are BS, in his opinion.
So how does he explain the existence of Navalny then? The existence of opposition? How does he view it? And what does he think's going on?
He thinks that there are a lot of people who are understandably unhappy and who are liable to support Navalny. He's also probably realistically aware that Navalny doesn't have an enormous amount of committed support. And that's part of the reason he doesn't want his name mentioned. So Putin and Putin's spokesperson Peskov, and in fact nobody at the top of the Russian regime mentions Navalny's name. So currently Navalny is the patient residing in the Berlin hospital who is a Russian citizen. He's not Navalny in their press releases. And they are asked, why don't you mention the name? And they say, well, that doesn't change anything. We're talking about the same person. It's not just that he doesn't want Navalny to make gains by the airing of his name. It's also that he thinks that he is Putin. He doesn't want to share a platform with Navalny because that will just, as it were, legitimate him when he is nobody. And so his main response to Navalny is, who do you represent? In other words, yes, in theory, I could bring this guy into my office and talk to him, but what will happen next? He can't guarantee anything. He can't guarantee that X and Y will happen. What's the point of dealing with this person? But in the middle of this, it's really worth inserting the thought that he is dramatically likely to overestimate the personal motives of an opposition politician and underestimate, if you like, their social motives, underestimate how much they might genuinely be motivated by the fact that his regime is enormously corrupt, enormously capable of acting on a regular basis against the interests of its citizens, etc. So, but he's also going to admire some qualities about Navalny. He'll admire Navalny's determination and consider that, if not an actual, then a potential threat. a very small number of Russians are deeply sympathetic to Navalny's message. And then a thinner but broader range of the Russian population is sympathetic to Navalny's critique of the government without being fully subscribed supporters of Navalny.
How does Putin make decisions? What are his kind of qualities as a leader and as a strategic thinker?
Well, we're asking this question in a sort of strange context. And the context is that Russia's ideology for foreign policy is action. Action and the perception of being seen in action. That's it. That's more important than what's actually done. So the key thing about the Russian interference in Western democracies that we've seen over the last couple of years is that they want to be seen interfering, and they want the conversation about their interference to be as dramatic as possible. That's much more important than the details of it. So there is this very peculiar postmodern twist to the way Russia operates on the world stage. Its home policy is simpler. Bottom line of home policy is let's keep the population from protesting significantly. But foreign policy is about permeation, is about intrusion, and it's about intrusion and permeation often done indirectly. So it's about kind of seeping into every part of the world you can seep into. And that might be done, if you like, governmentally, or it might be done by quasi-private, indirectly government-affiliated bodies. And so it's a kind of almost intangible web. And so that's, in a way, sits a little ill at ease with Putin's own personality, but at the same time he's practicing that. His own personality is in many ways pragmatic and conservative. He's conservative in the sense that he is not somebody liable to be rushed into a decision. He's a man who is actually in love. He gets off on decision making, which is to say that if you put him in a very, very tight spot where he has to make a very difficult decision, he won't panic. He won't rush it. He will make it as quickly as he can, but in a measured way. That's really important. The other thing that's really fascinating about Putin is that he is terribly psychologically legalistic. Now, the courts in Russia are completely broken and muzzled. I mean, there is no independent judiciary. But at the same time, Putin speaks in legalistic terms about everything, not just because it's a facade for covering up what's really going on, but also because he really gets off on that. He believes in that. The single most important thing to say about Putin's decisions, though, is that he is tactical more than he is strategic. And Ukraine was a perfect example. If you take the situation back a year or two, it's not that Putin sat there with a folder saying, this is how I'm going to chop off a bit of the Ukraine and intervene in the rest of the country. No, that folder wasn't unavailable to him, but it got taken out only when circumstances allowed for it. So he is a guy who is always responding to the latest development as opposed to acting out a large predetermined plan. And that's why there is probably more reason to worry about things that he might do that he clearly is not planning to do at the moment.
So that is that he might take bigger risks.
it's not completely inconceivable that Putin gets involved in the Baltic states in the next 5 years, without him at the moment planning to do that at all. But circumstances could arise. And one of the circumstances that one always thinks about is anywhere in the world where there are Russians present who could be cast as having some kind of a complaint, who could be cast as being somehow mistreated. It's always a danger that Putin will want to get involved there. It's very important that because the mechanisms of leverage within Russia are so limited for him now, not just because he is less powerful relative to the people around him than he used to be, but also because the state is so dysfunctional, you can't really do much. You can do a lot in foreign policy, however, and foreign policy is used as something that you dance around with and shake about in the hope that it affects the domestic reception of the government. This is one of the basic ways Russia is different to Belarus. The credibility of the government is tied to the perception of Russia's position in the world. That's not the case in Belarus. The population in Belarus are not looking at Lukashenko's credibility as a guarantor of Belarus's position, on the global stage in the 21st century.
So what are the drivers of foreign policy? If there isn't a grand plan, which is what I'm sure lots of people in the West believe, what is driving him to do certain things?
What's driving Putin is a sense of a world in which there are a couple of major powers, 2 or 3. They each have their sphere of influence, and within these spheres of influence, they should be pretty much allowed to do what they like, and they should be the guarantors of stability in these spheres of influence. Because Russia is not in a place to do that in the modern world, that strikes him as wrong. It strikes him not just as something that's against Russia's interests, it also strikes him as something that's against the interests of stability in the world. This is a very Soviet perspective. It's the perspective of people who were educated and brought up in the Soviet Union before the Afghanistan war, which rather smashed the idea of the Soviet Union as being any good at guaranteeing anything to anybody in its interventions in different parts of the world.
So is it a vestige of a Cold War, a sort of late Cold War mentality? I mean, how elastic is his thinking? How adaptable is he to the the sort of changing situation in the 21st century?
Extraordinarily ill-adapted, and getting iller-adapted by the year. On top of this sort of geopolitical outlook that's a bit stuck in the past, that's the outlook with which he walked into office. And so when he was more friendly toward NATO and Europe and the United States in the first term, and he was continuing in many ways Yeltsin's policy, he weren't comfortable with that. He didn't want to do that. And so he walked into office with this geopolitical vision of the world. But since then, he has acquired something else, which is a certain sense of mission. And that mission is to do with Russia's role in the world. And unfortunately, we are reaching a stage now where his sense of that mission aligns it with his own personality. So he thinks that he is the man to guarantee this mission. What this mission is very difficult to clarify, because it's both mythological, but also so spectacularly full of false empirical belief that it's difficult to present it. But I think that one feature of this mission is that he wants his attainments on the global stage to be continuous with the best attainments of the Soviet Union and the best attainments of Tsarist Russia. the person Putin models himself on above all is Tsar Alexander III. And Tsar Alexander III's reign was tragic for Russia, and some people would argue tragic for Europe too, because this was a very reactionary man who took office because his progressive predecessor was assassinated, as he had a relatively progressive constitution on his table. Putin models himself on one of Russia's most reactionary rulers, but worse than that, most historians agree that Putin's opinions of Alexander III are themselves false. So it's an unlovely role model he has, but his own account of his role model is in dreamland.
And how much of Putin staying in power is what you've just described, which is Putin's worldview, and how much of it is simply a calculation that life wouldn't be very nice for him if he left office?
I think it's 50% what I've described and 50% the sense that life wouldn't be nice. So he has failed completely to create the kind of institutional procedure that could guarantee a person leaving office security. That's his failure. And he's on the wrong end of it now. And he now believes that there isn't a way to achieve an exit strategy whereby he has his safety guaranteed. He believes there might be a chance of that, but he doesn't see a real way of guaranteeing it. And I'd say that's probably 40 to 60% of the reason he wants to stay, but it's not the only reason.
And lastly, just because we're losing the light, there are some people in the West that have this idea that Putin is gay. What's your sense of that, and what's your sense of Putin's view about social issues, homosexuality, that sort of thing?
Putin is homophobic, but I would say mildly homophobic. And therefore, he isn't terribly much behind the homophobic policy agenda in Russia. He's certainly responsible for it. But he is more than capable of having gay friends. And this, in a way, speaks to the situation in Russia today, which is that it's an absolute disaster to be gay or trans, all things being equal. But in the elites in Moscow and Petersburg, there are a lot of people who are, to an extent, openly gay and are allowed to live that way. So the anti-gay agenda in the Russian regime is not basically motivated by a sincere moral conviction at all. So Putin is regressive. I mean, he would be unimpressed by a reasonable feminist perspective. He doesn't really care much about these issues, but he is not, I mean, on this, he is relatively pragmatic. He's a conservative guy, brought up in the Soviet Union. He's not unemotional. So it's not just that, he can be traumatized by historical events in a sincere way, as opposed to just in a calculated way pursuing policy. He is also capable of sentimentality. He holds grudges, he is ruthless, but he is also capable of being attached to a certain kind of story. And I'd even go as far as saying that a personal story shown to him could make him, in an episodic way, more lenient on somebody who is acting against his interests within the borders of the country.
Is he going to be in power in 20 years' time?
The likelihood is that Putin will stay in power for a long time, but become progressively less powerful and become more of a symbolic figure. And one of the fascinating things that's, in my opinion, mostly missed in the West is that he is enormously less powerful now than he was just 5 years ago. He's still the single most powerful man in the country. But if at one point there was a situation where he had, 50% of the power in the country, now he might have 20. with the next guy having 15. So it's a different dynamic. He's still the most powerful man there, but he's losing power and adjusting to that reality.
And what is causing that?
What's causing that is that he is in an ongoing dynamic of negotiation and mutual exploitation with the elites around him. That's an unstable process where he doesn't always get to arrange things in the way that he wants. Part of the thing that's really important in terms of understanding his role in that dynamic is that he is a facilitator, he is a triangulator, and to some extent he leads. But in domestic policy, he's doing a heck of a lot less leading than we might think looking at it from the outside.